Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. What I'm going to do is probably just after each slide, I will check for messages in the chat box, and I'll check for anyone who needs to be admitted as well. I should get a notification when people need admitting to from the waiting room. So yeah, thank you for coming to today's event, which is all around safeguarding and digital outreach. This is a topic that has naturally come up, first of all, since Brightside's existence, but second of all, and more importantly, throughout the COVID pandemic, and in all the webinars we've had so far, there has been space for discussing safeguarding. It's kind of been a section in each area that we've talked about, whether that's been our discussions around summer schools, our discussion around how we work with schools generally, and we heard a lot a couple of weeks ago from an assistant head teacher. If you haven't managed to listen to that session on working with schools, it was a really useful one for listening to what schools' current priorities are, and certainly was really interesting from their point of view around safeguarding, and we'll touch on some of those ideas today. So we'll be talking through kind of Brightside's response to safeguarding generally, so what we do on our platform. We've been working in the digital space for 17 years, so we'll talk to you about what safeguards we've kind of always had in place on our programs, things that are kind of exclusive to how Brightside works on our platform, but other things that you can consider as well. And then we'll hand over to Abby from Kcrw, who will talk through the kind of process that Kcrw have been going through in responding to safeguarding and digital outreach as well. Yeah, so that's how we're going to go through today, just admitting a couple of more people through the chat box. Once Abby and I have spoken, there'll be time for questions, so you can write down your questions in the chat box as we're speaking. And what we'll do is just scroll back to those when the presentations are finished. So do feel free to write stuff during the presentations. That's no problem, that's definitely encouraged. And we'll answer those when we finish the formal side of the meeting. After those questions, what will be helpful, is if I just put the agenda on the screen. After those questions, we'll move to breakout discussion. So those of you who've been coming to these will be used to kind of getting put in breakout spaces by now, and you might have done them on other Zoom calls if you've not done them with us. And it will just be to consider some of those key questions that we've been looking at today. Lots of you emailed in questions in advance as well, which was really useful, so I've added those to our discussion lists. I think today is going to be a very talky webinar. I mean, they always are, because that's the whole point of them, but I think there'll be a lot more on the discussion side of things. Hopefully we'll have a bit longer in the breakout rooms. I certainly won't be talking for very long at the beginning. I'm very keen to hear from Kcrw's approach. I think we've heard a lot about Brightside, so I'm going to give you the highlights of what we do around safeguarding today, and then we can focus on Kcrw's, and then having some joint discussions as well. And then we'll send the information out like normal. So just to go back a bit, everyone's doing this fantastically already, but do be mindful to keep yourself on mute throughout until we move to the breakout spaces, just so we can all hear. Keep your video off, mostly to help with connection as well, but also just to make sure that the screen doesn't kind of jump around to other people's videos. Feel free to put these on for the breakout spaces, however, so you can see who you're talking to, and then use the chat box for any support that you need around tech or any issues that you're having. Good question that's just come through about the previous webinars. So in the email that I send out with your with the slides from today and the recording, I'll send you a link to where all the other webinars can be viewed. So there's a page on the Brightside website, and for each one you can view the recording, you can look at the slides, and you can look at the summary notes that we made from the meeting as well. So for those who aren't aware, the previous topics that we looked at, we had an overall webinar with the sector where we kind of fleshed out some initial ideas, which then turned into the webinar series. And we looked at summer schools and moving those online. We looked at digital resources generally. We looked at strategic planning. So that was kind of leaning towards senior managers in organisations and institutions to think about what long-term effects of this might look like. And then we had our working with schools session. So that was the original 4. What came out of those was 2 topics people wanted to hear more about, which was monitoring and evaluation, which took place last week, and the slides and notes for that will be made available after this session as well, when I put them on the Brightside charity website. And then this session about safeguarding. And as I said earlier, safeguarding really has come into every discussion that we've had so far. But I know that people are keen to have a longer conversation about it and really hear about some of the key ideas people have been looking at. Please do join in the conversation. I think what I found so useful about using this hashtag digital outreach over the last kind of 6 weeks since we started it really is having a look and seeing what other people are doing in the sector. We've got our newsletter that's going out every fortnight. There's one coming out later today actually, where we capture some of that best practice. So today we've got some news from Bath and their campaign around kind of the digital divide, and some excellent work they're doing there in partnership with us and lots of other institutions and organisations. But we're really keen to hear what people are doing in this space, so that we can share that news with each other. And something that we want to keep going as well. Digital isn't going away. It's not just a second best option. It's something that really has the capacity to lead the way. And once we figure out some of the longer term implications around things like the digital divide in terms of access, once we make sure we nail safeguarding on every possible platform, it's something that can be a really powerful intervention to accompany face-to-face as well. So today, the purpose of today really is sharing learning and ideas for safeguarding. There are so many activities that are happening, that you've all been moving online, and safeguarding has been obviously a major concern for everyone during this time. And there's loads of great practice going on. The other thing that's happening is loads of people have different rules as well. So I think it'll be useful to talk through those. I know Zoom, for example, is one that has been contentious with some schools or some institutions saying a flat no to using Zoom. So other people have used Teams. I was talking to a student group this morning, a student-led volunteer group at Birmingham Widening Access to Medical Schools, and they've been using Instagram Live, and I was talking to them about the safeguarding precautions they use around that. It sounds really useful, so we can talk about that later. But I suppose it's trying as much as possible to bring us on the same page is the purpose of this conversation today, to see where we disagree, to see where we agree, and to see what next steps we can take as well. So hopefully we'll hear some examples from each other today, and I will ask when we move into the breakout spaces for one person just to take some notes and send them back to the chat box, so we can make sure we've got a really comprehensive set of notes to send to everybody later. I've put together a set of, we looked at that agenda, haven't we? A set of questions to consider that came from you all beforehand. So one that's come up a couple of times is around live versus recorded sessions. So I know previously for some of you that might have worked with Brightside, sometimes we have recorded sessions like this that we've done, where it might be for training mentors and mentees on our platform. And we might send those out, those recordings, to people who are unable to attend a live session. Or we might send videos, instructional videos, to people on how to access our mentoring platform. Now, in a world where you are full to the brim of live interactions, it doesn't necessarily matter if you have one or two that are recorded, because the bulk of your activity does take place live in your life. However, what we've all been noticing, of course, is that the more recorded interactions that you have now, the potential more difficulties you can have with engagement. Are people going to go back and look at something that's been recorded? I mean, even these webinars that we're recording here, they're all about 90 minutes long. So are people going to go back and watch the whole thing? They'll probably skip through and find the relevant parts of them. So we have to think about what's more effective, live versus recorded. But then if we're thinking about live, we need to think about how we safeguard live sessions. And I'll talk to you a bit about how Brightside has been doing that. And then platforms. So, we just had a message through the chat box as well around kind of social media and looking at things like Instagram Live and Facebook Live. But what platforms are we confident in using? The fact that not one person has asked me a tech question suggests to me that in the last 8 weeks since the pandemic, since lockdown started, we've all become pretty comfortable with Zoom very quickly. But the question is, what platforms are we confident in using safely? And there's been kind of stories going on about almost every single platform, and people are forever finding new issues, I suppose, that we need to talk about. So we need to think about what's reasonably practicable when we're looking at these platforms, and how much we can do to ensure safety, and what we can do to ensure safety where I know, for example, lots of people have been doing recording of live sessions, and they've been doing that to say, if an issue did come up, we then have evidence of it. If that's at least we can offer that, then that is something. And then what about working with under 16s? I know people have been asking this question about whether you get parental permission for them to log on to live events, or to receive recordings, or to take part in programs. From a Brightside point of view, whenever we work with anyone who's under 13, they often need to have parental consent as well. So there's a question around how we work with parents. Someone also asked about safeguarding training. So we need to think about the way in which we're training the people who are delivering activities, whether that's your student ambassadors, whether that's volunteers that you work with, or whether that's your staff. And I know Kings have got some information on how they've kind of upskilled their staff in this area. And the Sutton Trust information that came out also speaks to this. So it's definitely worth looking at. And again, I'll include that in the notes. There's also the question of one size fits all. I guess the fast response to COVID was, okay, we're moving online. What safeguarding do we need to have in place immediately? Now it's thinking beyond that, really, as this is a little more, I don't want to use the word new normal, the phrase new normal, but as we move into more detail, I suppose, we're now thinking about how do we safeguard different types of students as well, or what about students who don't have digital access, for example? How do we make sure they're still safe in activities that are taking place? And then how do we work with parents and schools? So these are the questions I want us to have in the back of our minds today, and we'll come back to these probably in about half an hour when we move to the breakout spaces. Any other questions that you have, whether they're for Abby and I, based on what we're talking about, or just other things you want to hear about, put them in the chat box, and then we'll make sure we talk about all of those when we move into the breakout spaces. So let me talk to you about safeguarding at Brightside. And I'm going to do this purely by talking about the Brightside platform, so we can talk to you about how we've approached digital over the last 17 years with our online mentoring, really, and what the key factors have been there. It might be helpful for whether you're working with Brightside or not, to think about other apps that you're using, other programs that you're using, or other things that you're setting up, how you might be able to apply some of these to that. So the Brightside platform has always had secure accounts for users. So users have to have an account to access a mentor that they're speaking to, or to access e-learning activities that might be on the platform. So from Brightside's point of view, it's an account-based system. So different to something, I suppose, like running a webinar on Zoom. Obviously today we added a registration feature, and we do that for the webinars that we do with young people, as I'll come to speak to. But we require accounts to be made for Brightside. Brightside mentoring, for those who don't know, is not a live function. It's a back and forth messaging system that's both on desktop and on app. I suppose I could show you the app, but my phone's been playing up today. You know, the reason that we don't do it live is because we have a filtering and moderation system. Because there's a few thousand young people on the site at any one time, we need to make sure that the messages they're having are safe, the conversations, the way they're conducting themselves is safe, both the mentors and those who are being mentored, the mentees. So for Brightside, it's always been that kind of back and forth system, so that Brightside staff can check messages that have the potential to be harmful. We have, so our moderation system that exists is based on attachments, it's based on hyperlinks, and website links rather, and it's based on stop words as well. So any attachment that gets sent through a conversation between a young person and a mentor has to be checked. The same for any website link. And then the list of stop words kind of checks in with those. So anybody who says, hi, nice to meet you, immediately checked to ensure that they are saying nice to meet you, and that they're not saying it would be great if we could meet in person to discuss this further. I don't think any young person would quite like that. But that's essentially how we've done it. And now we've had the question before about working live, and we have done a few sessions recently actually, and I'll talk about them when I move on to our live section. About how moderation and that protection might work in a live setting. But for that reason, it's messaging only and not video. We want to make sure that the conversations that are happening are safe, they're secure, and that the young people and the mentors who are on the programs are protected as well. So every message has the potential to be filtered. And Brightside staff are responsible for doing those, or partner institutions that kind of work with us on our platform. We have a few other safeguards on our system, if I just go back one, sorry. And that's first names only as well. So to prevent kind of users from finding each other on social media, users from finding each other on other kind of websites, or contacting people outside of the platform, only first names are visible and personal details cannot be shared. So again, that filtering system picks up if someone uses the word email, or if someone uses the word phone, or tries to send numbers, +4407, all of those numbers get flagged instantly to make sure that numbers are being sent, as well as the written word 7440. So we've got lots of things like that on the platform that protect people. And I suppose if we're conceptualizing that and thinking about how that works outside, we need to think about people. We need to think about Zoom, for example, or webinar software where people log in with their name and what their display name is, and how you might be able to fix those. To make sure that people aren't giving away personal details when they're logging into systems like this. One thing that we've been using quite extensively with schools and with some of our partners at the moment is a feature called Ask the Expert, which is not a mentoring program, but instead we kind of host on the Brightside platform one of our volunteers who writes a short profile about their career history, and then we take in anonymous questions throughout the week. The benefit of this is that volunteer is not interacting with the young person, so they don't need to be DBS checked. Instead, they are hosted on the platform. They don't have an account on the platform. We send them questions and ask them to answer those, and we post the answers. Now, what we've also been doing that is inviting those volunteers to come and join us for a webinar where we do a kind of Q&A with them, and young people are allowed to listen in. So I'll move on to that in a second. But when young people are using that Ask the Expert program, they're only able to talk to Brightside. They're not able to talk to each other. They're not able to talk to the volunteer, and the same for the volunteer as well. So that kind of access is not there. Young people using the site can only speak to people they've been matched with, or Brightside, or the coordinator staff from institutions that are taking part. So it's a secure system in that way. I suppose the question that Brightside have been asked, as I alluded to earlier, is during this time when we have less live interaction, how Brightside can be a bit more live. And we would be reticent to ever take out our moderation features. When teachers are using things like Google Classroom, or we're kind of doing webinars with young people, we can see all of those messages that are taking place. Those conversations, they haven't got a member of staff in each one on the platform, which is why we have that system. It wouldn't be feasible to have a member of staff in each one. And so obviously we wouldn't take that feature out. However, what we have done a few times actually over the last few weeks is a live moderation feature where we have invited mentors and their mentees to come to the platform for an hour perhaps for a live kind of session. So Brightside staff, and then usually someone from the partner institution as well, will sit on the moderation side of the platform, and we will approve the messages instantly as long as there are no issues there. So the users can sit on their chat box, see the messages come through, and get chatting to one another as though they were talking. So they're pretty much talking live unless there's an issue that we need to flag. And what we've seen through that is a huge amount of messages that have gone through. It's been really successful. It's more resource heavy for sure. You know, we couldn't do it for every project, and we won't be looking to do that for, we won't look to make that the norm. The purpose for us about mentoring is that reflective experience. But certainly for this current situation where people are looking for that live interaction, and we're also looking to fill time slots as well with meaningful interaction, it's been really useful for that. So we've done that with UCL Target Medicine, we've been doing that with Brighton University, and a couple of our schools as well. And it can be really, really effective as long as it's kind of set to a minimum time. And those expectations have been talked about. What we've been doing with a couple of schools is these World of Work webinars, as well as our Brightside talks, which we do for our alumni, but we've all kind of opened up to anyone as well. But we do that using Zoom, and we found the Zoom safeguarding features to be really, really useful actually. So Brightside is the host always, and the screen sharing is set to the host only, which means that any young person couldn't share their screen. The volunteer who joins us for these talks couldn't share their screen either. So usually we go through the slides for that volunteer. As we're all practitioners here today, I'm going to let Abby do her own slides and share her screen. I'm not too worried about that. But yes, on the webinar function when we work with young people, we don't allow screen sharing. And the participants are muted as well. We keep them muted. We ask for those questions to be submitted beforehand to the volunteer that's coming to talk, whether that's on World of Work, which is just volunteers coming to talk about their jobs, or Brightside Talks, which is slightly broader and might cover other issues such as CVs or kind of skills related work. Yes, so questions are all submitted beforehand. There is a chat box obviously on Zoom, and we do allow students to send messages through that with further questions. But obviously if a student sent an inappropriate message, they could be removed from the webinar as well. But the direct messaging feature is turned off. So today you can all direct message me, you can all direct message each other as well. And we turn that off when we're having a webinar with young people to make sure that any communication is seen by Brightside. Incidentally, Zoom also allows you to view a chat transcript after the session. And actually that chat transcript will also show every direct message that's been sent, whether it's been to the host or whether it's been between users. So do be mindful of that if you're ever using Zoom and direct messaging another user, particularly if you're saying you're not enjoying something, because the host will be able to look back at it later. We record meetings as well. I think this has become standard practice by most people actually, to make sure that if there is an issue, it can be picked up and then we can go back to that and kind of evidence it. And so far we've been doing that with year 10 and above. We've been promoting these to our alumni network, which is 16 and above. And in the schools we've been working in, it's been year 10 and above. I also did a focus group last week, which was for some post-16 students. They were in year 12. It was a school up near Manchester, and we used Microsoft Teams for that. Works in a very similar way. I think the registration feature, the registration feature that comes with Zoom is very helpful because we can make sure that the right people are kind of signing up to attend. You can ask questions as part of that registration as well. So today, we kind of asked what your job roles were, and we asked if you had any questions that we could use to make into the discussion topics. So there's lots you can ask around that. That is really helpful. And from a point of evaluation for us with working with young people, we can see who's coming again and again to those World of Work webinars. So it certainly allows both that safeguarding feature and check-in, as well as some information on evaluation as well, which I find very useful. Just some questions that I've got on Zoom. I'll quickly answer those actually because they link to the safeguarding element, then I'll hand over to Abby. We've upgraded our Zoom, so we pay for I think it's the package that goes up to 500, which is why that was the cap for that first webinar that we did. On the free version, the majority of safeguarding features are still available. I'm trying to think of something that's not available, but certainly you can still mute participants upon entry. You can stop the chat box. Yeah, those key features are still there and available. On a GDPR point of view, yes, so the focus group that I ran with young people last week, they were aware that they were being recorded and they had a consent form for that. When we've been doing our World of Work webinars, because students are only messaging through the chat box, the students' names aren't used. The only person being recorded, I suppose, is the volunteer who is speaking. We don't say kind of so-and-so has a question. We just read out the questions that have been pre-submitted. So on that end, the students are aware that the session is being recorded, but their participation is not recorded. Yeah, so with the, to speak to Hetty's point that she's brought up, with the paid version of Zoom, there are additional things you can do like polls and Q&As. These can be quite useful for bringing in some of that interaction as well. From a safeguarding point of view as well, they're quite safe. I mean, I can do a quick poll now to show you what it looks like if you like. No, I can't. It's going to make me do something else, so let's turn that off. But yes, so those are add-on features that you can do to bring in some of that interaction as well. Please do keep showing questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Abby so she can tell us a bit about what's been happening over at King's. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Chris. Can you see that presentation okay? Brilliant, and you can hear me okay, I'm assuming, because you answered that question. Hello everybody, and thanks to Chris for inviting me along today. I work at King's College London as the Widening Participation Partnerships Manager. I've started working there in February, so I'm quite new to King's, but I've worked in WP in total for nearly 6 years. Across 3 different universities. What I'm here to talk about today is just the King's College WP team's approach to online safeguarding. So how we've kind of looked at online safeguarding, especially in light of COVID-19 and the current situation. So the first thing that we did was really to think about the fact that safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. So it shouldn't really rely on one person in the team having knowledge and then that person being responsible for everybody else. So really, safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. So that means that its best approach is collaborative and to get everybody involved in that. So the way that we did it at King's was to establish an online working group. In that we talked about all the considerations that we needed to think about in light of the current situation. And from that, we decided on several different work streams. So those work streams concentrated on technology, So having a look at the technology that we use already, what's available at King's, what's external, what's out there that we haven't considered about before. We also wanted to create a work stream on standardisation. So actually the standardisation work stream has only sort of kicked into gear now, after the other work streams have kind of done their job first. But that's basically ensuring that everything that we do decide is agreed across the team. Everybody knows what to implement and the best way to do it, and to agree that best practice within our team as well. We had a work stream on evaluation. Obviously that's very important, and a lot of our programs, we'd already done quite a lot of work on how the evaluation would work. So in light of COVID, how is that going to change? How does online platforms change that evaluation as well? So not just how that evaluation is delivered, but how it's delivered through the online platforms, and also what needs to change in light of the changing situation. And then I chaired a work stream on safeguarding and GDPR. And we linked those two work streams together because we thought that they did actually go hand in hand, and there's a lot of considerations to do with data and protection that also feed into safeguarding. But within this webinar, I'm predominantly going to focus on the safeguarding aspect of that work stream. So in terms of the work stream about safeguarding, we really wanted to make it clear what actually we needed from the online platforms that we were going to use. So the first thing we did was create a bit of clarity, just in terms of thinking about what we needed the technology to do. So very much leading from what do we need it to do, rather than just looking at what's possible and what's out there. From there, we reviewed potential platforms, and we put together a big list of everything that we thought was either essential, that it should have, or that it could have. So essentially, you know, those things that are nice to have. And that was a really good way of thinking about what we want that technology to do, and then to sort of review it in line with those different approaches. With the safeguarding element, we also then focused really heavily on prioritising people over technology. And I think that's a really important sort of value at King's and across the team, but really putting people first rather than technology and what technology can do. It's really important to be led by people, and I think that's also very important in safeguarding terms, because safeguarding is all about making sure that those young people that we work with get a good experience, but that they're protected and that they're safe. So they very much took precedence in what we were doing. We also wanted to make sure that everything we decided on was underpinned by research. So we did quite a lot of research into different platforms that were possible. We contacted lots of organisations and other universities in order to make sure that what we went forward with was based on everything that we could research and understand. Linked back to that kind of idea of thinking about what's essential, we also made sure that we thought about what are the unnegotiable elements that safeguarding needs to happen on the platforms. So for example, something like moderation is actually unnegotiable when you're working with young people, because you have to make sure that that kind of any contact that they're having with adults is safe, and is it's moderated, and there is an adult present who knows conversations are happening. So that's to make sure it's safe between young people talking to each other, but also young people talking to different adults. So whenever we looked at all of the different platforms that were available, we looked at what the communication channels were, and if, for example, there was the option for people to directly message each other without that moderation, then we discounted that platform, because that was such an important safeguarding element that wasn't negotiable, in terms of even if that platform offered a lot of things that we wanted, for safeguarding reasons, we wouldn't be able to go forward with it. Something else we also did as well was we did a lot of reviewing. So we reviewed lots of things that are out there already in terms of advice from different universities, their safeguarding approaches. We had a look at what they did, and we also looked at what we had already existing and thought about whether we needed to adapt anything or change it to make sure that it did meet safeguarding priorities. So the outcomes for us from those groups and the careful consideration and research is that we decided to use 2 key platforms. So those 2 key platforms for us is Kcrw, which is a King's specific platform. Essentially it's a university Moodle, so it's a King's version of that, and then also Brightside. So I think it's important to mention that we ended up using 2 platforms predominantly because we were being led about what those platforms needed to do. So because we couldn't find one platform that could do everything, we decided on using 2. And I would say in addition to that, we're also using Teams, and that is our sort of recommended across the whole institution platform for doing live sort of streaming and live events. And I think Zoom has some extra functionality, but it seems that Teams is going to introduce that into their functionality too. So in terms of breakout rooms and being able to ask questions, etc., or put your hand up. So as an institution, we're favouring Teams. And the good thing about Teams is that you can link it through Kcrw as well. So there's something called Kcrw, which we're getting trained on in our team, but essentially that hosts videos. You can also host them on YouTube externally, and then you can play those videos that are recorded through Kcrw. So as much as possible, even though we are using another platform, externally for those young people, the 2 main platforms they need to think about are Kcrw and Brightside. Because even though created content might be done elsewhere, that will be put onto Kcrw. So that will be the sort of main interface that they interact with. And some of the reasons for choosing these 2 platforms is that we thought that with Kcrw, because it's King's Moodle platform, it actually gives the young people a really good university experience. So it's introducing them to what university is like before they get to university. They're using a platform that other university students will be using from the same university. It introduces them, even if they go on to a different university, to how online platforms work once you're at university. So in terms of, you know, how that works, what it looks like, how to sign in and do things. So it's actually giving them a university experience because it's branded and it links to useful King's resources, but it also gives them a bit of a step up and a practice of how to start using those platforms that they will be using at university. One of the reasons for using Brightside was down to the moderation. So on Brightside, as Chris was saying earlier, you're able to moderate those messages between young people. You can facilitate group work on there as well. And I think when we did a lot of research into working with young people on online platforms, a lot of that says that you really have to take consideration of the access that young people have. So the fact that you can do pre-recorded sessions and share that kind of learning with them is really good, but we wanted to make sure that that's mobile optimized. We know that Brightside's mobile optimized, and actually if they're doing some learning, the very best thing that you can do at the moment in this situation is allow those young people facilitated learning and the ability to speak to each other and speak to student ambassadors. And we thought that Brightside's a really good platform for that. And it's also something that a lot of our participants are familiar with. So it makes sense for them to use something that they already know how to use. Another outcome from the group was that we thought that all staff should do some training. And the best training that we thought was out there was the NSPCC. So as sort of mandatory training when staff start in our team, they all do an introduction to child safeguarding. And the NSPCC also do some online safeguarding training, which is actually very comprehensive and really useful. I think it's a very useful training in terms of thinking about how young people use the sort of online world anyway. When I did it, I learned about some platforms that I'd never heard about before. So that was quite useful, just thinking about, you know, from that child's point of view, how are they using the internet? How do they engage with it? And then also from a practitioner's point of view, how do we keep those young people as safe as possible? Just touching on student ambassador training. So we're going to update all our briefings for the student ambassadors and consolidate some of the key learnings that we got from the NSPCC training, just to sort of build on the training that our student ambassadors have already had in child protection. So they have quite a lot of training already. So we're just going to pick out the key elements that are relevant to sort of the online world. And then some other outcomes are that we've reviewed a lot of our existing documents, so anything related to child safeguarding, and we're also creating some new documents. So I'll just go through those. So some of the adapted documents, we're adapting our safeguarding policy and risk assessment. So we're sort of having a look through there in terms of the main categories to see, is there anything that we need to update in relation to online safeguarding? And then also we're introducing a new section to our risk assessment that sort of has some general rules in terms of what we need online platforms to have. So for example, the ability to moderate and to not have any direct messaging between young people or between them as student ambassadors or speakers, etc. But then also what we're doing on there is any platforms that we've looked at, we're including a little risk assessment for each of those platforms. And then it's very clear in terms of the whole team, in terms of which of those platforms we've taken forward, and if we haven't, why we haven't done that. So we've kind of got an ongoing document of which platforms we risk assessed, and then the reasons for, or for using them or not. And we're also updating our reporting procedure. So just to make it absolutely crystal clear in any situation, if a safeguarding incident happens, how those young people then, how the student ambassadors report anything that those young people have said. So making sure that that's really clear. We've also created some new documents. So an online code of conduct, which is a little bit like a consent form, but it very much concentrates on those young people signing up to what they will and will not do as part of being a part of an online programme. The important thing about that code of conduct is we ask young people and their parents to sign, and that's all young people that we work with as well. So even up to year 13, we will ask all of them and their parents to sign it. Something that I took away a lot from the NSPCC training, which we've sort of integrated into the code of conduct, is that it shouldn't just be a list of don'ts, it should also be a list of do's. So really giving that ownership of understanding the risks of the internet and being online and interacting in these ways, giving those young people ownership over their own input and contribution that way. So for example, then taking some responsibility for only submitting appropriate comments, and also then if they come across anything that they think is inappropriate, or they're contacted by anyone inappropriate, that they feel confident enough to then report that and who to report it to, but also that they can block people as well. So I think that's really important to note. And I think in terms of parents, we've asked them to sign it as well, so that we know that they've read through it with that young person, they're aware of what they're doing, working with our team and how that's changed from the initial programs that they might have signed up for. But it also then gives those parents a bit of ownership and control as well in understanding what their young people have signed up to do and not to do as part of that process. And then lastly, we're also doing an online safety policy statement. So really that is to just give some really clear guidelines for staff, including students, in terms of how exactly we're approaching the online space and what we're doing within that. I'm just going to touch a little bit on vulnerable groups as well. So when we've been thinking about our safeguarding approach, we've obviously taken into account vulnerable groups, and in terms of widening participation, there's a lot of evidence out there that suggests at least a third of young people don't really have access to their own laptop or phone, etc. In terms of a bit of context in how we approach vulnerable groups within the KCRWP team, so we do have 2 full-time members of staff who are focused on vulnerable groups, who have their own mobile phone, who we give young people that mobile phone number if they need to speak to anybody, particularly about any issues that come up. So the idea with that is that there is a direct line for anybody who's in a particular vulnerable group, so maybe care experienced or estranged, etc. They have somebody that they can talk to. So they're always on hand, and that's always our approach, with making sure that we can give tailored approach to those young people and they feel supported. As a whole, obviously we saw the research out there saying that a lot of young people didn't really have access to resources, or maybe even a safe environment in their house, to, you know, a nice quiet environment where they could actually sit and do the work as well. So we kind of thought, well, let's find out about our participants who we've already got on our programs. Let's ask them directly, you know, what kind of resources they do have access to. Are they sharing? How much commitments do they have already? If we were to start doing online provision, what would that look like and what would work best for them? So that's been a really useful exercise in then us understanding what our young people want and how they want it delivered. We've also thought about different measures and approaches that we can put into place in light of the current situation and the fact that some young people are more vulnerable than others. So for example, we've decided that we'll give data bursaries to young people who need data. And you know, we have money in the budget now because we don't have to pay for travel. So that's a nice, easy sort of win that we can change and do that instead. We're also really thinking about, and I think I mentioned it earlier, just, you know, the approach that's best for young people. And because smartphones are probably the easiest way that young people will engage with whatever content we do, we're making sure that everything we do is accessible via a smartphone to make sure that everybody has access to what we do and nobody is left out because of that. And then I've mentioned testing in there as well, because obviously this is a whole new world. We haven't done a lot of this before. So we're putting quite a lot of emphasis on testing, doing really good evaluation. So not just asking the young people how they've experienced the things that we put in place, but actually looking at the analytics. So if we send out a pre-recorded bit of video, can we see when the young people are watching it? Do they watch it at the time given? Do they all, you know, watch it at a particular time? So it'll be interesting to see what happens when we start doing that more. We're also trying to do some live sessions, but focus those more on the engagement side, so Q&As. So again, it will be very interesting to focus on that. And we definitely want to make sure it's accessible for everybody. So we're asking for questions in advance as well as during to try and make sure that we do address everything in the right way. I've also included a link at the bottom. It's at the end of the slide as well, but Standalone are hosting something next week. So about supporting estranged students, and I think they're a really, really good resource. So I'd highly recommend looking at that if you're thinking about vulnerable people and how best to support them. So just to wrap up, I think the key learnings going through this process, one of them is just, and it might sound obvious, but safeguarding is safeguarding. So actually, just because it's in an online context, that doesn't actually change it. It's still safeguarding, and much of the same things are the same. So for example, the reporting mechanisms are very similar when it's online. And online doesn't necessarily create issues, but it can facilitate them. So it's a lot about thinking, what is safeguarding, how does it work, and how does that then apply to an online situation in the same way that you think about that offline. At the beginning of this, I would say a learning was that we were tempted to prioritise the technology over people in need. So, you know, what's the most fancy technology, what's the most engaging, we should use that. But actually, going through this process and making sure we did our you know, risk assessment and looking at the different platforms, it was very apparent that really you should focus on people over technology. I think parents is a really important thing actually to consider, definitely in terms of safeguarding, and especially in light of the current situation, because young people are at home, they're with their families, they're with their parents, and it's very important to ensure that they know what their children are doing and what they're involved with as well. And I think if you can get young people and their parents engaged and on board, that's beneficial for the young people, and it also means that the parents understand what their children are doing. And something from the NSCC that was quite useful was the idea of safeguarding. Actually, young people really need to know who to report that to in an organisation, but they should have an open communication with their parents as well. And that's especially important if they're using that kind of technology at home. So it's good to get parents on board with understanding, but also knowing about safeguarding. So from that, with our code of conduct, we've included some links for parents as well, in terms of where they can go to get support with thinking online and how platforms work and which are safer. So we've included some links within that, just so that they have that support as well. And this last point, I think, touches on a bit of what Chris was talking about earlier, that it's tempting to think about creating content now that has a very long longevity, which I think is good, and we definitely want to do that. But I think you do also then have to balance that with how, are people going to watch that? Is it still going to be relevant in the future? Or for how long is it going to be relevant? And also, a lot of our job within WP is to curate, not necessarily create. So I think as you're curating lots of information and advice that's out there and ensuring that people have access to what's most useful, then that's about that sort of tailored support and what's right for them right now. And that might change and be different in the future. So I think sort of having a bit of a balance of that as well. And that's it from me.
Cool, thanks, Abby. So we've had some questions that have come through the chat box. So yeah, please do keep sending them in. If I scroll up, what I'll do is answer the ones that came up when I was speaking, and then Abby, I can read out the ones that have come for you as well, and then we can answer those. And we'll leave your slides because I think there was one or two that asked something about something you put up, so we can have a look at that. So I think I answered these ones. So there's a question about this is going back to Zoom. Actually, before I answer that, I just wanted to pick up on two things Abby said, actually. One was around looking at a variety of platforms. I think that's absolutely essential. I mean, we've been using Zoom for about two and a half years. So we've always done kind of training and sessions for our volunteers via Zoom, and sometimes for young people. Normally post 16, where they haven't been able to make our in-person sessions, when we normally go and launch kind of Brightside programs. So certainly it's something that we've relied on for a long time outside of our platform, and we've been using Teams for the best part of a year now as well. And I think for us, our approach is absolutely, there are so many good platforms out there, and it's working out which ones are the most relevant. The Brightside platform can't do anything. That's why we can't do anything. That's wrong. Can't do everything. That's why we use Zoom, and that's why we use Teams. But then also some of the survey sites that we use as well, that are very good for kind of analysing data, things that Brightside platform doesn't do. So having a look out there, I think, is a really essential thing to do. And then the second point, just what Abby was saying about longevity, with the session we had with the assistant head actually a couple of weeks ago, was talking about that kind of school need now, and it was more on that curation point. It was we want to see the best of what's out there. We don't want necessarily for you to make loads of stuff for us. We want your help in finding what the best is that everybody's using. So not necessarily what you think is good that you've made, but where you can get that from everywhere. And I know that school in particular, they were using things like Unifrog, they were using Brightside, they were using other portals. So definitely, I think, to speak to Abby's point around curation is so important right now. So if I just go through a couple of these questions then. So there was one around the chat box feature on Zoom, if someone does say something that's inappropriate. So it's not happened yet, to touch wood. I was just checking back through the Zoom features, and there isn't a kind of delete function for messages that are in the chat box, which the Brightside platform does offer, if that ever came up in conversation. But my course of action, I suppose, there, if I was to risk assess that and think what was reasonably practicable to do, would be to remove that student. Would then be to kind of address the comment that was made. If it was severe to the point where they had said something that was, I suppose, vastly inappropriate, we would have to shut down the webinar and potentially restart it. But I think that would be the most you would be able to do it in that situation on Zoom. The same as if we were in a classroom environment, I suppose, and we might need to remove an individual, but we can't stop everyone else having just heard that comment. So it would depend on what was sent through. If it was a link to something that was potentially offensive, then we would have to end the chat conversation, make sure that was dealt with.
Chris,
yes.
if it's useful, I do know that on Teams, if you hold a live event, you can moderate the chat that comes through.
That's good.
Choose what questions do go through and what don't. So it does mean that you have to have at least 2 members of staff if one's presenting, one's doing the moderation, but you can do that on Teams.
That's really useful to know. That's really good. Yeah, really good point. Question from Hannah around participants having camera and microphone on. So from the microphone point of view, you can set Zoom so that people are automatically muted and the host is responsible for unmuting them. The video, you can turn it off for them and then they can't turn it back on. But you can start it without it on, and then I guess you just have to ask the instruction that they don't put them on. Someone asked me what we were meant by evaluation as well. I think this was kind of in between, and both me and Abby talked about evaluation. From Brightside's point of view, it's what Abby was saying really about the analytics. You know, we want to look at who's accessing what to see what's effective. So we've been kind of doing very short surveys at the end of Zoom conversations that we've done with young people. And then we've compared kind of across in the schools that we're working with, we're looking at who's coming week after week. So who's seeing this as being very effective, who's asking lots of questions, who's coming once, and then writing a feedback form saying they've not found it useful and how can we find out how to make things more useful for them. The Brightside evaluation approach usually is very much about baseline and exit, distance travelled, like I'm sure a lot of you do. For some of these, for our webinar series with the schools, where we have asked them to make accounts on the Brightside platform first, and we have done a baseline assessment of them, and then we do a short survey after each webinar, so we can capture some of that distance travelled. It's not perfect, in the same way that no evaluation is perfect, I suppose. It is a bit different than the normal way we would do things, but certainly that's what we're looking at to see what success and what improvements we can find from this. And then got some questions here for you, Abby. So one was about Kcrw. Is that the system that you talked about at one point, and whether that was a King's specific system, or if that was? I don't think it's
King's specific, but it is what the King's sort of Moodle team and IT use to talk to Keats. So I would assume it's used across Moodle, but I don't have much experience with Moodle outside of Keats, so I'm not 100% sure. I can probably send through at least how it's spelled to Chris, if that's useful.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of these institutions with the different aspects on Moodle, isn't there? I know for the master's course that I'm doing, we were using something called, you know, I have no idea what it's called actually, but I would not recommend it. It was terrible. It was one of the most difficult video chats that I've ever been on. Just purely the functionality of it. So I will find out what that is called and tell you not to use it. And I hope that none of you are using it. Maybe it was just back.
Yeah. I guess the point of Kcrw is that then if you've got like a large video, you can upload it to that site. And I think if you uploaded it directly to Keats or Moodle, it would crash and it would be really difficult.
Okay.
So Kcrw sort of posts it and then it links through to that site. So it for the user, they wouldn't necessarily know that they're viewing it on there.
That's really useful. There was a question here around live streaming on Teams and whether that's taken place with the pre-16 audience.
We haven't done it with a pre-16 audience, and I don't think we have any plans to do live streaming with pre-16 either. Sorry. Yeah,
we've had a few year 10s and year 11s who've accessed some of our Zoom calls. That's purely the purpose of the program that we were putting together with schools was outlining support for year 10 to year 13. So year 10 who would have been going on work experience soon. So we have, that's the age group the school identified. So we've been led by them. The normal Brightside Talks series that we've done, which is open to any young person, they have to register, but that's a post-16 program. So outside of that specific school, we haven't done pre-16 either.
We're moving to do contingency planning for the first term of the new academic year because the rest of the university are also doing that.
Yeah.
But I would say at King's, we mainly work with pre-16 via schools. So I imagine that a lot of that work will be looking at how we work with the schools in terms of contingency rather than pre-16 as individuals. Yeah, we're very much the same. And I think there are a few questions have alluded to this, I suppose.
we have to think about our avenues to the young people as well. So with our, for us with the Brightside Talk series, we've targeted post-16 students for those. Where we have worked with pre-16 is where we've been led by the school, and the school have said, we would like to work with this age group. We're happy with what we've seen. We've got confidence in that. So I think we have to think about the avenues that we're approaching the different young people at as well. Question on Keats was, do the outreach students have to register as King's students in order to access Keats?
Good question. So it is slightly complicated. So we've worked with our internal IT department, and they're basically, we've submitted all the young people who are taking part in the summer schools who we want to use Keats. They have a list of all their names and email addresses, and what they're doing is creating them temporary King's accounts and then using that information to upload them onto the Keats system. So we're contacting our young people to let them know how their sort of summer schools are going to be run now that we're running them online, and that they will get an automatic email from the Keats service when they're signed up. So then they just have to like click on and I think set up their password, etc. So it's very easy to do. But the internal side of getting them set up is the slightly more complicated bit, especially giving them, we use K numbers at King's. So that's like a number that each of them have. And that has been a little bit difficult to get. And we've tried this in the past outside of the COVID situation, not been very successful. So quite exciting in some ways that we've been able to do it in light of the current situation, because it, it gives those young people a chance at seeing what university students get to see when they enroll at uni.
Yeah, that's really good. We had a few questions on the NSPCC training. I think there's a link to that in one of your slides, isn't there, Abby? That one. So
it's after this slide.
Yeah. So when we email those out, you'll have the, perfect, there they are. I know we've done this at Brightside. I couldn't remember if the organisation has to pay for access to the training or if it was free. I couldn't remember.
It is a cost. They have reduced it, and if you buy them in bulk, it's cheaper again. But I think from memory, it's around £30 per person, so it's not very expensive.
Yeah, and definitely worth it as well. That's the one that all kind of Brightside new starters do, and it's a really in-depth session and covers a lot.
Yeah.
So we've had NSPCC. So Hector, you asked a question about the MS Teams live function. I think Abby was just speaking to that about the kind of the moderation system that's in there, with being able to see the questions that are coming through and approve them as well. You asked about using it for under 18 delivery. So obviously, Abby, you talked about at the moment it's been post 16, and there's that contingency planning around that. I think from what I've seen, I did a focus group last week on Teams. I think I would definitely say that it's safeguarding friendly. I think the way Abby was speaking seems to say the same.
Yeah. From my limited knowledge about Teams, I think it's pretty good in terms of moderation, and I think there's a function on it where you present and you can't even see who else is a participant, and there is a function to send messages, I think, to everybody or particular, but I think you can amend that as well.
Cool. Student ambassadors who are going live and going through safeguarding training, do they need to have safeguarding training and DBS checks before they go live?
I mean, all of our student ambassadors do have DBS checks already, and in terms of live content, we wouldn't ever have a student ambassador that wasn't with a member of staff. So in the same way that you wouldn't have in person a student ambassador on their own with a young person, we would do the same on an online situation. So there will always be a staff presence, or if we're using Brightside, for example, because that's moderated, that means that a staff doesn't have to be present, but it is moderated and it is checked.
Fab. Yeah, and that's the same for us as well when we bring volunteers in. We make sure there's a member of staff there to facilitate and act as the main host. With some of the functionality on Brightside, where volunteers are not in direct contact with young people, but they're answering pre-submitted questions that we post for them, they won't need a DBS check for that because they're not interacting with anyone and they have no capability to. So we've used that kind of as a short-term fix where volunteers who were due to be on projects that perhaps cancelled and wanted to help, and schools that were kind of desperate to work with some volunteers, we've been able to do that, which is good. And there's been a question on the kind of the code of conduct and the safeguarding policy first. Was that localized to the specific work that you're doing, or is it an institutional wide safeguard? Is it kind of WP team focus in what you've been looking at?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So at the moment it is just WP focused, but we're also feeding into an institution-wide version as well. So we've gone ahead to do that to make sure that we've thought about the policy and the guidance for staff right now, but then we're also feeding into wider King's and how that works across the whole institution.
Fab. The follow-up from that one was thinking about if for perhaps, I think this must be alluding to things like summer schools or kind of open events where academics might come along to sessions, or people who are outside of the WP team, to make sure that they're following those same procedures, I suppose. Yeah, so I assume a kind of conversation happens there around safeguarding best practice if somebody's coming in the same way that we would prepare volunteers or student ambassadors.
Yeah, and I think as much as possible, we are veering towards pre-recorded content. In kind of like you were saying, Chris, that we pre-record that content, so there isn't actually any interaction directly between speakers and those young people. And we're also sort of rethinking a lot of how, what are our programs and what are their key aims and objectives and how do we achieve those, not just this is what it was going to be before, how do we then do that online? So kind of taking a step back and rethinking about, okay, we wanted to have an academic side of it. What is the best way to do that? Is the best way actually to do group work and to do a research project rather than just have an academic session delivered online? So I think we're trying to take a step back and think about how we can best facilitate that kind of learning in the current environment as well.
Definitely, and I think that helps massively on the safeguarding perspective. Actually, if we think holistically like that and don't directly translate everything, that might answer some of our safeguarding questions as well. If we think, okay, what can we do that fits the bill instead, that meets our aims and objectives, that might reveal how to do things safely rather than that direct translation. A question around kind of parental signatures. If students don't get those, are they then not allowed to take part in an online programs?
So the way we're doing it is we're putting that consent form onto a Bristol online survey. So that's the kind of online survey tool that we use at King's, and having it that way instead of a document, so a Word or PDF, means that it's accessible via phone. So I think if you send a document and then ask people and they've already got a smartphone, that is literally going to be impossible. So we're sending it via a form, so that's mobile optimized, and then asking them to read the do's and don'ts that they're signing up to. So, using appropriate language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they tick to say that they understand it, and they put their name and date in it. And then the same as with the parents.
I think that's a really good point, and certainly what we've done as well is we've been working with a very small charity here in London who work with primary school children, and they've required parental consent, but it's been much easier to do that from a form that can be filled in on the phone rather than kind of sending a document to be filled in.
Yeah, and I guess on that note as well, sorry, we would send it to the young people and the parents' email addresses.
Yes.
They've all had it. Yeah,
definitely. And I think that speaks to Sarah's point here, which is around what's the policy for digital or typed signatures for parents and codes of conduct. And I think that kind of we know from using forms that's an okay form of consent, isn't it? To kind of to use those tick boxes to say I've kind of agreed to this, I've put my name on that, and that's as good as having a signature. So I think that answers that one. Someone has asked around if your contact has come directly through students, how you've gone about getting kind of parent contact information. Is that part of the sign-up process to your programs that they have to provide a parent detail?
Yes, yeah. So when young people apply to the programs, they provide parental contact information as well.
Mm-hmm. There is a really good question. I'm aware that we probably ought to go into breakout spaces, but loads of questions are coming through that we can answer. So if people are happy, we can do this. Let's answer these two questions, then I'll give people maybe 10 minutes to discuss in smaller groups actually. Really good question here around summer schools and how we can get young people to talk to each other safely to get that sense of belonging, and any tips or experiences. From a Brightside point of view, that we have a kind of a group chat functionality, which again is moderated, so students can be in a group together. we actually, we've been using this for whole year groups where we've been working with pre-16 students on a project basis where they've had work to do in school and they've had one mentor in between them as a group. But you could have groups with just young people in, and they can still be moderated, for example. That can work really well. I know people have used online forums as well, which is available through Brightside. Abby, I don't know if you've got anything on that about kind of young people liaising with each other in a safe way.
Yeah, I agree with what you've said. I think we're planning to set up groups of young people on Brightside so they can talk to each other, as well as like project groups as well. And something we're also thinking about trialing is asking young people to sort of sign up to a half-hour session, which is what is with one of the program leads and a student ambassador, where they can kind of have some or one-on-one, but one-on-two. It's compliant, but time to ask specific questions that they've got, and a bit of time for them to really feel like they're being listened to and they've got the opportunity to speak directly to staff, but also those student ambassadors. So I know that's not directly peer-to-peer, but it's trying to sort of create that sense of them belonging to that programme and being listened to as part of that. And I think the peer-to-peer thing is going to be the hardest thing to address, being online, and I do think that's where Brightside is really good, because it then can facilitate those conversations between peer-to-peer as well as with student ambassadors.
Definitely, and Teams have got group functions as well, haven't they? Because I was thinking on Zoom, one of the things we do is we stop the direct messaging between young people purely because you can't see it in the moment, you can only look at it afterwards. But I don't know about, on Teams you can set up groups, and I assume that moderation filter, if there was a student ambassador, say in a group with 5, I guess you'd have to have a member of staff in those groups, so it might be resource heavy to do that live, I suppose. That would be the difficult instance. I know, yeah, one of the other things we had on our list was kind of those social media lives, and again they allow people to kind of post questions, and you can't necessarily moderate those. It's a really interesting set of discussions actually where we draw the line, I suppose. This is probably a good time to go into some breakout spaces. So I'm going to set the timer for 10 minutes. It's going to automatically assign you to a space. If one person could just take a few notes about some of the key issues you discussed, just I think essentially keep talking about what we've been discussing, ask some more questions. And what we'll do is send out again the kind of the topics that were discussed and some of those key questions that are coming through. This session isn't to be the answers to everything. I think we're going to come up with even more questions, and we can continue to use this network that we're building here to share those ideas around. So I'll stick you in those now, and it will tell you when you're being sent back as well. So let's have, yeah, that many rooms. Automatic. Okay, off we go.